Hello there. It has been decided by your betters. Get your wallets out and pay up. Now, if you haven't already done so, please do subscribe and then like and comment below. And welcome to the show. Funny how the UK financial black hole was 60 billion quid a couple of weeks ago, and then it was pared back to 50 billion when it looked like things weren't going to be quite as bad as predicted. But now I see that some are again talking about a £60 billion black hole. Just as Rishi Sunak opens the door to talks about the UK paying the so-called climate change reparations to developing nations. Sounds like our first annual bill will be 10 billion then, a starting point no doubt for much more in future. No wonder the Tories are gearing up the taxman to thoroughly fleece us. And over the weekend we had Ed Miliband, Shadow Secretary of State for Climate Change and Net Zero, talking about paying money to poorer nations on a so-called loss and damage basis. And he really balked at the term reparations. But if we're going to pay out based on blame apportioned by others for our previous actions, then reparations is what it would be. No? Anyway, here's what Miliband told Laura Koonsberg.
Part of the debate is going to be about the richer part of the world paying the poorer part of the world to help them deal with carbon costs. And some people even call it reparations. Essentially, wealthy countries ought to be giving money to countries that are finding the impact of climate change very profound and difficult. Would a Labour government pay reparations to developing countries for climate change?
I don't see it as about reparations. And actually, when you talk to lots of campaigners, they don't. This is about the issue of so-called loss and damage. Mm-hmm. This is the fact that poorer countries are facing massive effects of climate change. You know, we see it all around the world.
And we can quibble about the terminology.
Well, no, the terminology matters because lots of people are allergic to the term reparations. But
our viewers will want to know also if a Labour government would transfer large amounts of cash to the developing world, including to China. Would Labour give money to China?
It's not about China. No, it's not about China.
So
I don't think China isn't necessarily asking for money. Look, this is about poorer countries that are on the front line of the climate crisis. Pakistan had these disastrous floods recently, 30% of the country underwater. So this is about global solidarity. I mean, yes, we have some historical responsibility, but this is about global solidarity, and it's absolutely part of our aid commitment. You know, we don't think the government was right to cut the 0.7 aid commitment.
But so you would, just to be clear, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but to be clear, a Labour
absolutely,
government would
it's about supporting poorer countries, completely right. And let me just say, it's morally right, Laura, but it's also in our self-interest too. Because if we don't act and if we don't help countries around the world, we're going to end up with the problems that countries face in terms of refugees, for example, coming back onto us.
Except that China is part of the group of countries that is asking for loss and damage, to use the terminology.
We should recognise loss and damage, absolutely.
Including for a country with as much money for China.
It's not about giving money to China. I promise you, Laura, it's not about giving money to China. That's not what this is about. This is about countries like the Maldives, like Pakistan and others. And we have aid commitments. Now, unfortunately, the government has resiled from many of our aid commitments, but it is absolutely about recognising our moral responsibility.
Okay.
So Miliband reckons many people are allergic to the word reparations. Are they? No. Many people are appalled that UK politicians are lining them up to fund the goings-on of governments abroad over which they have no control. Isn't that taxation without representation? And what Miliband is trying to do is bow to the demands for fictitious reparations while attempting to repackage it as some sort of non-liability loss and damage aid package. As I see it, we're being softened up for a massive hike in taxes, part of which will be siphoned off abroad to furnish foreign government bigwigs and officials with cars, mansions and jets, so that our politicians can feel good about themselves. And that Labour shadow net zero secretary would gleefully dispatch bucket loads of our cash across the world, and he calls it moral responsibility. What? Basically apologising and paying compensation for providing the world with everything from engineering to computing. Give me a break. And don't think about levelling up across the UK. This is the new levelling up across the planet, using your money but without your consent. Were you asked about any of this, or was it vomited out on the floor in front of you? And before anyone says that safeguards will be put in place to make sure that the money is spent properly, I would point out that we can't even hold the SNP to account for what they decide to fritter UK taxpayers' money away on. What hope would we ever have with oversight of money spent in countries far away? No, it would be pay and forget, hoping they won't keep demanding more, which of course they will. So do you really think that we could stop corrupt practices relieving us of most of that loss and damage money before one solitary citizen is aided in any way? Really? And as was pointed out in the Miliband Koonsberg video, China wants a slice of our dosh too. Yes, after the pandemic and openly salivating about invading Taiwan, the nuclear weapon-armed China with a space program wants paying for loss and damage. Yeah. And do you really think Miliband wouldn't happily sign that particular cheque? And as an aside, on the subject of recent floods in Pakistan, just go and research deforestation in Pakistan and see what you find. We've also had the UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, saying that the planet is doomed unless some sort of historic pact is signed between the rich and poor nations of the world. And this all revolves around stumping up with $100 billion every year in climate finance from rich countries to hand over to the poorer nations. And don't tell me the demands won't keep expanding year on year, nor that we won't see some very wealthy state leaders start emerging. This is about a Marxist WEF-like agenda to redistribute the world's wealth around the planet, and that includes UK taxpayers' money, your money. And that will be catastrophic for the developed world as even more money is sucked out of our economies with no guarantee in whose grasping claws it ends up. But further, it would not end with mere finance. We're also being softened up to a new world order with fewer and fewer borders. With climate change-based migration being normalised and encouraged. It started already. Part of the loss and damage approach, or reparations or whatever, will be for developed countries to be forced to accept ever more freedom of movement, whatever the impact on our societies, while we will be trapped carless in our own locality with insufficient carbon credits to do much more than just exist. You will own nothing and be happy. And this has reached the point where, in accordance with Treasury rules in the UK, nearly half the foreign aid budget has had to be redirected into the UK to pay for hotels and the like, something that can only get worse. And right now in COP27, you see the former PM Boris Johnson waxing lyrical about net zero. And no doubt when he gets to the microphone, the current incumbent Rishi Sunak will try to outdo him in his commitment to the net zero cause. Maybe that was the plan all along. And we now know, via Ed Miliband, that any future Labour government would be even firmer devotees to net zero and this whole wealth redistribution project. But today the PM said that these talks about loss and damage payments were not about reparations and liability. But he did not say payments would not be made. He's just doing the Miliband-style repackaging job. But Boris Johnson did say that the UK can't afford to pay cash. But what we could do was help with the technology to help fix the problem. But who's paying? And he might be hoping to keep his party and constituency voters happy. Has he still got his eye on the top job? So when Jeremy Hunt rises to his feet at the dispatch box on Thursday the 17th of November to give his autumn statement, just consider where some of that extra tax take might be headed. And also consider why our pensioners might not be getting their proper top-up. And then consider that you will have absolutely no say in any of this, because most people normally knee-jerk vote for either the Reds or the Blues at general elections. And elections are the only time you get to influence anything. And both Red and Blue, as well as the Lib Dems, the Greens and the SNP, are wedded to net zero. And it looks more and more likely that they all back this reparations rubbish. So it'll be in the small print of their next election manifestos, and people will do the usual and wonder why they got stung again. And we'll also wonder why we pay every year more and more for ever poorer services, while we help fund a form of supranational Marxism. But at least our politicians can virtue signal on our behalf while we slog, freeze and starve. And now here's Richard's take on all of this.
Thank you, Jeff, and good evening. With global leaders prancing around the world stage, pushing their virtue signal green agendas whilst confirming pre-agreed decisions on CO2 emissions, one is left asking, why do they bother to attend the COP meetings at all, other than for self-promotion? Let us give money to support countries who have been damaged by global warming, is the cry of the left-wing politicians. And if our so-called Tory government is anything to go by, it also looks like that is the cry of our political leaders on the right. Well, I say. And that should tell you all you need to know about the illusion of democracy in our modern society. And national treasures like Ed Miliband... sorry, I was nearly sick then. Yes, Ed Miliband is pushing for British taxpayers to send reparation money to countries such as Pakistan who have been negatively impacted by climate change. Yes, just as Britain is struggling to fill a black hole in public finances, let's give money to poor countries with nuclear weapons and space programs. Granny can wheeze, Granny can freeze, as we send Granny's dosh far overseas. If you think the great wealth redistribution is all about saving the planet and levelling up globally, think again. The measures being called for to tackle climate change, such as switching to electric vehicles, have devastating impacts upon the environment. And without China and India giving full cooperation to tackling climate change, the whole thing is just a joke. Or we could just shut down the 100 companies that are apparently causing over 70% of all global emissions. But in these days of systemic disinformation from our governments and the media, you can't even trust those figures. In 2022, who do you actually believe? Which source of information do you trust? Who is impartial and who is not? We are all kept in a constant state of fear and confusion. The world will boil, freeze, explode, or we will be taken out by a dirty bomb or a lab-grown nasty. And that's just the children's television, for goodness sake. Is it any wonder the soy latte guzzling yogurt weavers are gluing themselves to any hard surface? Maybe they could all form a commune and glue themselves together into a giant pulsating mass of gullibility. I don't see why our former Prime Minister Boris Johnson doesn't join Just Stop Oil in their protests. He might as well, considering the enthusiasm he has for pushing the same agenda as them, and he too could glue himself to an inanimate object like Ed Miliband. Anyway, back over to you, Jeff.
And thank you for that, Richard. And finally, when subscribing, please don't forget to press that little bell and also select the all option, or you won't get any notifications when I publish a new video. And thank you all so much for taking the time to watch the show.